Okay, we have some folks already excited and sending us some greetings. So excitement is there. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kolika, and I'll be your host for today. A few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. However, please be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. If you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. Now, we often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. Now, we love to hear your feedback on how we can improve on these webinars, and you can do so at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. And by the way, all the links that I'm announcing have been already shared with you on the chat or here in the live event Q&A window. I would like to invite you to join our public community by visiting us at aka.ms/security community. Now, that's the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews. And for that to sign up, the short link is aka.ms/securityprp. In there, you can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Ian Hellen and Tiander Turpijn will take us through the customization of Azure Sentinel using Python, that is MSTICPy and Jupyter Notebooks. Ian is a principal software engineer, whereas Tiander is a senior program manager, both with Azure Sentinel team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to them. Ian, Tiander, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Valen. So, as Valen said, my name is Ian Hellen. I'm a developer in Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. We do work as part of Azure Sentinel, but also work with Microsoft Defender for Endpoints, Defender for Cloud, many other security teams within Microsoft. I spend almost all of my time working with Azure Sentinel, working on MSTICPy and building notebooks. And Tiander.
Hey everyone, my name is Tiander. I'm a senior program manager in the Azure engineering division, specifically in a team who is working with customers to identify kind of challenges upon deployment, adoption, and to unblock customers when they hit kind of challenging scenarios. And one of the scenarios that we're going to talk about is notebooks, which traditionally is a data kind of analysis analytics platform. And we decided to do a series of webinars. We did one in January where we had a webinar on fundamentals and starting with notebooks, different options. And we decided to do a series of 3. And this one is one of those that we want to dive more into the MSTICPy to kind of demystify, if you will, what it exactly is. Okay, back to you, Ian.
Hey, we gave it the wrong name for demystification. MSTICPy. It's very difficult to type because we want to type the P before the C all the time. At least I. Yeah. So Jupyter Notebooks. It's a kind of thing that when you get Jupyter Notebooks, you think, oh, it's really obvious why you'd want to use these. So as Tiander said, they're used by data scientists and scientists who are not necessarily data scientists, astronomers, genome researchers, that kind of stuff. Used very widely in the scientific community and are gradually making their way into other areas like the security community. So the first thing is in terminology. They're not to be confused with playbooks or workbooks. We've got a lot of books things in Azure Sentinel. They do have some crossover, some similarities with both of them. So why would you use Jupyter Notebooks? It's a little bit like logic apps and playbooks. It's a kind of programmatic interface. It gives you a programmatic interface to Azure Sentinel. It gives you other things as well, like the ability to kind of display visualizations, query external data that's not in your Azure Sentinel workspace, and kind of auto-record. So auto-record whatever you're doing as you're going along. So there are a few different use cases. So there's the ad hoc use, if you like, as like a cyber data scientist. You're doing an investigation, maybe querying data about a host or an IP address, checking threat intelligence. And as you're doing this, you're kind of building up this portfolio of data inside the notebook, which is like the document. That's probably that's kind of thing, the way I would use it. It's probably, as we discovered, like probably a more minority use case. It's difficult to say, but I think it's probably a more minority use case. Two other use cases I think are perhaps more compelling. So one is to create notebooks that are templates of SOC processes. So let's say you have a security incident that arrives. You can have a template with all of the code pre-written that executes a certain number of checks, like is it one of our IP addresses? Is it an external IP address? Is there any threat intelligence reports in VirusTotal or X-Force or Alien Vault? Where is the IP address located? And all of those things you can put in a kind of notebook and just run more or less with a single click. And because they're in a notebook format, it becomes very easy to edit those templates. So it gives people who are not necessarily very code, wouldn't describe them as developers, maybe it's like SOC analysts, gives them the ability to run flexible kinds of analysis and get more or less immediate results without having to stitch together manually lots of queries and things like that. The second, I think, interesting use case is a similar thing, and the next webinar, Pete Bryan's going to talk about this in a lot more detail. It's like automating these processes. So rather than have an analyst have to reinvoke a notebook and run it, why not have, in response to certain types of incidents that are coming in or alerts, that would automatically trigger a notebook to run and do initial triage, either giving a verdict about whether it's whether this is a false positive or something we need to investigate. And if it is something you need to investigate, to be able to get the portfolio of initial data, like what the threat intel reports are. So that's not, automating is not something we're going to be covering in this. It's more sort of nuts and bolts of Jupyter Notebooks and using MSTICPy with those.
Hey Ian, a question on workbooks, right? When, as a customer, would I pivot over from workbooks to notebooks? Because there are similarities like visualization, and we typically position Azure Workbooks as dashboarding, but you can do the same thing in a notebook. But why would you pivot over from workbooks to notebooks? You talked a little bit about it, but I noticed that sometimes there's confusion, right? Workbooks, notebooks, you just mentioned it. Why would I use workbooks versus playbooks and notebooks? I think it's a good thing to point out.
Yes, some of it is, as I said, there was a certain amount of overlap. Some of it is like personal preference. It's like, do you want to have the code like much more reachable? One of the differences between workbooks, they tend to be fairly static sets of queries that are related to visualizations, and you could do a lot of powerful kind of pivoting and stuff like that inside a workbook. But if you want any programmatic kind of procedural control, like if we get this kind of response to a query, then do that. If we get some other response, do something else. Or you want kind of interactive, you know, at this point I need to modify the date ranges where we're looking at, and you do the next step, and then you want to modify something else. But if you want more procedural control, then a notebook is the best option. For playbooks, I think there is a certain amount of that in playbooks. Like you can have like processes that's related to maybe sending an email and giving a kind of an approval for something. So notebooks sit somewhere in between those. I think they're more kind of interactive procedural, give you more kind of interactive procedural benefits. You're also, because a notebook is like, and I'm talking really just about Python notebooks, there are other notebook types running different languages like PowerShell, but it's certainly in the Python community. You're not kind of limited to the widgets and stuff like that that Azure Sentinel gives you, or Azure gives you. There are hundreds of thousands of packages. You're probably not going to need all of those, but there are many different kinds of visualization options, decoding, analysis packages, things like that somebody else has already built for you.
Yeah, and I specifically like what you mentioned on ad hoc, right? So a Jupyter Notebook allows you to do ad hoc kind of investigations where a workbook is kind of what it is. It is a kind of visualization. You can do additional selections, but if I need to suddenly find out, hey, who is this IP address? That's something that you could either do with notebooks, which we are going to talk about, and then we have a playbook, which is actually a logic app, which we position as our SOAR capability in Azure Sentinel. So yeah, that's a good distinction between logic app playbooks, notebooks, and workbooks. Great.
Okay, cool. So what is a Jupyter Notebook? For people who don't know about it, there's a front end and a back end, as there are with most things. And the front end is a little bit subtle. So in most cases, it will be a browser, but it could also be something like Visual Studio Code. And the browser itself obviously doesn't have much intelligence beyond kind of rendering HTML and JavaScript. So the part of the front end is a Jupyter client, which is a rather complex bit of JavaScript code that does the kind of rendering, you know, the creation of the user interface, the whole user experience of Jupyter. This knows how to talk, this is like the purple horizontal double-headed arrow, knows how to talk the Jupyter protocol, which communicates with a backend, Jupyter server. And although it's not shown on here, there's actually a controlling part called Jupyter Hub. So every time you open a notebook and connect to a kernel, what's happening is a backend process is being spun up. And this backend process is actually where all of the code execution that happens as part of your notebook. So if you run 2+2, you know, like a simple thing, then that's sent back to the Jupyter server part, executed, and the results are pushed back to your client for display. Another, I think I mentioned before that these kernels, these Jupyter servers, can have different language kernels. So most of the notebooks I work with are Python-based kernel, but you can have PowerShell, C#, Julia, R, number of other kind of kernels. There are actually hundreds of different kernels you can run. By far the most popular, I think, is Python, but there are others around. The final component in all of this is the IPYNB file that is output. So this is a JSON file which contains, and it's sort of auto-saved as you're going along. So this is a JSON file that is the definition of your notebook that contains all of the code and the output, and that's automatically persisted as you go. So when you're running a Jupyter notebook, it isn't just you and the Jupyter server that are communicating. When you're using a Jupyter notebook with Azure Sentinel, that Jupyter server process is communicating with the Azure Sentinel over API. So it's pulling things like running queries and getting the results back. It might also be communicating to other places like VirusTotal and Alien Vault. So bear that in mind when we're in the demos, we'll be seeing a lot of the stuff appears on your desktop. It's not actually your desktop that's communicating with any of this stuff. It's the Jupyter server. Now, one thing I didn't mention is the Jupyter server can be, and the default in Azure Sentinel is that it's running in Azure Machine Learning as a compute instances, so virtual machines in the cloud. But you can also run the Jupyter server locally, or you can have like an enterprise Jupyter hub that these things run on.
Hey Ian, do we have best practices on where to store notebooks? We have them on GitHub. You can download them from a couple other places. Where do we typically suggest we store those?
I think GitHub is a good place for templates. So notebook that you created, you want to reuse that same copy. In Azure ML, that comes with, and we can have a look at that in a moment, that comes with its own attached storage, which is Azure file storage, but you can attach it to blob storage and other stuff. So the notebooks that you've executed and you want to save, then you obviously want those in some kind of volatile storage. I mean, GitHub maybe, it depends how comfortable you are with sharing your investigation data with the rest of the world, but certainly the templates, like what you're doing, as long as you're not saving any keys and things like that into notebooks, then that's I think that is a good, it's like what I use every day. It's where I have the codes, where we have our notebooks stored, and they're pulled from there into the Azure ML workspace to be executed.
Yeah, so you're saying you could host it on your private GitHub repo and synchronize changes, or you can have it locally on a server or your desktop and use Visual Studio Code, I guess. Yeah,
certainly where you execute it and where you store it are two different kinds of things. So I have like Jupyter installed locally and just install it as a Python package, or you can use a cloud Jupyter hub, which is what we do with Azure Sentinel. I mean, and you can execute the same notebooks in any of those things. So our default is to take you to Azure Machine Learning, which we'll look at in a moment. But you don't have to run it there. You can run both the back end and front end could be entirely private, either on your machine or within an enterprise network.
Great.
So notebooks are here in Azure Sentinel UI. At least this is the starting interface, the starting point, I guess, for the connection. And I'll explain a little bit about the user interface. So when you first go to, you see a list of notebooks, and these are templates, as I said before. So these are not directly executable. You'll see down here, I'll have some description of the notebook on the right-hand side, and I don't think this is very well labeled. It says save notebook. What does that mean? It means take the currently selected template and save a copy of it into your Azure ML workspace so you can actually execute and run it. Now, there's another tab here, My Notebooks. And when you first look at this, you won't see anything in there at all because you need to do one of these things. Either set a default Azure ML workspace if you already have one, or create one entirely. I've already set one up. In fact, I've set quite a few up. So I'm going to use that because it's not difficult process. It's like a 5-minute job and it's a sort of wizard-driven interface to create a new workspace. There's no cost, I think, although I'm not the expert. I'm an engineer, so I probably shouldn't talk about money. But I don't think there's any cost to having like an Azure ML workspace. I think you pay for the compute. You probably will pay for the storage to some extent as well. That's relatively cheap, but if you have your QA instances. So let's go to Azure ML. Well, actually, when you launch, now I've connected to Azure ML workspace. It's actually showing me the items that are in the root folder of Azure ML. So let me try opening one of these. How this will work. That's me. Well, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, I should have given a caveat to this morning. Both Tiander and I just came back from vacation. I came back kind of late last night to find complete chaos on my machine. I don't know. I had to reset all of the network, so I only got everything working about 15 minutes before we started here. So there are going to be a few rough edges to this this thing. So this is what the Azure ML like notebooks interface looks like. There's a bunch of icons down here that take you to different parts. And if you're interested in doing like deeper data science, automated pipelines to do machine learning and things like that, this is where all of these things. For notebooks, we're interested in 2 tabs. One is the notebooks one, as you might expect. The second one is you'll have to grapple with somewhat is the compute section. Because as I said earlier, you need a Jupyter server, something that will do the execution of the code. And creating these is very simple. Again, another kind of wizard interface. You get to choose which kind of, and for most things, unless you're doing very heavy duty things, you could probably get away with the 2-core, the 4-core is like, it's very good. And these are, when you create them, they're assigned to you as a user. Now, you can create them for other users, but these are not shared, so multiple users, any data that's on that machine is kind of like your own property. The notebooks themselves, I won't actually create another one. I've already got a few running there. The notebooks themselves are not persisted on the compute. This just does the processing part. The data by default is all stored in this shared storage, and you can see in this workspace I've only got one user, which is me, but there could be multiple other users, and this is shared storage. There's no if you really need secrecy between different people, you want to be creating multiple Azure machine learning workspaces, because but I think for most companies, collaboration between different people in the SOC is kind of important to be able to share stuff. So the shared storage kind of works very well. So your first arrival at Azure Sentinel notebooks, Azure machine learning notebooks will look a little bit like this. There'll be slightly fewer files in there. There'll be whichever notebook it was that you saved from the template. There should be a config JSON file, which is the basic settings for the, we can have a look at that. Well, it's not very nicely formatted, but it contains your tenant ID, the subscription ID, and the workspace name and ID for your Azure Sentinel workspace. So this is how we know how to talk back, or what to try and talk back to when we're querying Azure Sentinel. There shouldn't be very much else in there. I've created some directories. I've been kind of messing around in here.
So Ian, a question here. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between a workspace and the compute? What's the relationship between the workspace? Is that same as a log analytic workspace and compute? Can you compare that with just running a VM?
I mean, they are VMs, but they're specially configured VMs. So a workspace is a kind of a container. It's a bit like a resource group or an Azure Sentinel. So an Azure Sentinel workspace, which is a different thing, contains like a certain amount of storage and different user interface components, and might have like workbooks and playbooks and stuff like that. An Azure ML workspace contains things like attached storage, data sets, so things that are relevant to machine learning. So in our case, it will contain the notebook storage, and it will contain multiple computes. And if you have so these computes are just virtual machines, but they do have installed a lot of the kind of code that you will need to run this, like version of Python and stuff like that. And if it's a shared workspace, you'll see these are all happen to be owned by me, but if it's a shared workspace, you'll see computes that are assigned to different users. Okay, so as I said earlier, I think when we first started the whole notebook thing, we thought it was just like so compelling that people would rush to use notebooks, and would immediately grasp how like amazing they were and essential to their process. As it turned out, there was a bit of a higher barrier to entry than we assumed. So we recently revamped. These are published to GitHub, but they're not yet available. They should be in the next week or so, available through the. Let me flip back to. So the versions here, they don't currently correspond to the version I'm showing you, but that should be there within a week. You can actually get them from GitHub. If I remember, or maybe Tiander reminds me, I can show you towards the end of this notebook how you can get these two notebooks we're going to look at today to run through. So the first thing is maybe a little bit more of a tour around the UI. So it's basic kind of controls here, things like run all cells, interrupt. If you have a cell that's kind of just running forever and you want to interrupt it, restarting a kernel. So if the notebook gets into a really bad state, you can restart it, or if you change some kind of configuration, restart it. Over here are a couple of quite important. So this is the kernel. This is like which version of Python do you want running on the compute, and this is the compute we're currently running on. One button to avoid pressing accidentally stop compute, because that will stop all of your notebooks and any sort of save state, or the saved notebooks will be okay, but any in-memory things that you've done are kind of lost at that point. So avoid pressing that unless you really mean to do it. The cells in a notebook are either this type. Let's maybe look at a slightly simpler one. That's not a simple one. So this type are just text and graphics, and you can see one here. I've got an embedded graphics. You can also, I can find one that's. You can see here. You can also embed HTML. Not strictly speaking. Strictly speaking, it's a bit frowned upon in Markdown circles. To embed HTML, at least like code checkers say you shouldn't put HTML, but it seems to work fine. So if you want to do like what I've done here, highlighting or embedding images and things like that from different websites. So those are Markdown cells. The other type is a code cell, and this is a simple bit of Python code. Just adds 2 + 2, assigns it to the variable y. And prints out the results. One of the things you'll find, if we just comment out, is the last thing that happens in a notebook cell, even though we didn't say print, if it has a value, then the notebook will try to show whatever it is. So this could be, in this case, a simple integer, it could be a string, it could be a data frame or a visualization. One thing about Jupyter Notebooks is we talked about this kind of cumulative, building on progress as we go. Variables that are defined in this cell are available to later cells, so we can reference that y and show you the output. So that's very simple. The two main components of a notebook: executable cells and Markdown cells. And you'll see a lot of Markdown here. I haven't got time to kind of go all the way through it, but you can read it at your leisure. So the first thing we need to do is, because we don't want to write all of the code ourselves, we need most of the value of the Python ecosystem is in Python packages, code that somebody's already written and that we want to reuse. Now, fortunately, many of these packages are already installed on the computes for Azure AML, so you don't need to do much of the installing part. The other thing you need to do before you can actually use it in your code is to import the package through a set of import statements. Now, we spent quite a while working on a package of our own called MSTICPy. We have another kind of companion package as well, but this is our main one. So this contains a lot of like cyber security tools for using notebooks, things like visualizations, analysis, data access, threat intelligence lookup. And one of the things we found is the thing has got more complicated or has more features, let's say. Is that you need to do a certain amount of initialization, and you need some kind of configuration because it can do lots of different things. And in particular, the configuration for talking to other systems. So we saw in a graphic earlier on, communicating not just to Azure Sentinel, but to external threat intelligence providers. Now, each of those communications needs some kind of credential, usually an API key, to talk to those things. And it's not something you want every time you want to communicate with those services. You don't want to have to type the API key in. So there's an element of configuration as well, where we store that stuff either in a configuration file or a configuration file that points to storage of secrets in a key vault. So this notebook is all about setting that up. So it's all about installing MSTICPy, getting that working, making sure you have the right version, and doing some basic configuration. So you're configured to talk back to your Azure Sentinel workspace. You're configured to at least communicate with a couple of important things like this. In this case, we've got an example of VirusTotal and an IP geolocation service, MaxMind, that we use both of those quite a lot in our notebooks. So this is a slightly more complex example of an initialization cell. The most important part, really, you'll see in other notebooks, is this init notebook function. And this does a few other things. This we have here, we're just like upgrading MSTICPy to the latest version because we're assuming this is probably the first notebook you run. So we want to install MSTICPy. We're going to do some checking to make sure, are we running a version of the kernel that's at least Python 3.6. In this case, we've got Python 3.8, 3.81, in fact. So we're good. And we're also, I talked about importing packages. This also imports a bunch of things that we use commonly. So pandas is a data manipulation package, some IPython display things, and also a bunch of MSTICPy libraries that we'll use later. So to save you having to type your own kind of import statements, these just are then available to use directly as code. So so the first thing we're going to do is, I mentioned the config JSON showed you that. Now this contains details of your Azure Sentinel, the Azure Sentinel workspace you came from. But we found there are some limitations with this, so that the config JSON will only have one Azure Sentinel workspace. If you want to work with more of them, you start getting a bit stuck copying and pasting different config JSONs. So we've created a configuration file that has like more options. So it allows us to have like multiple Azure Sentinel workspaces set up, and also configure multiple threat intel providers, geolocation providers, and a bunch of other things. If you want to store them in Key Vault, also the Key Vault settings you'll need to store things there. So the first step is when we run the init notebook, it will look for a config JSON and it will pre-populate the details of this in a MSTICPy config YAML. So it's just taken that, and it will create two entries. One which is the the named entry for the Azure Sentinel workspace, and another one which is exactly the same thing, called default. And this means that you can, it just means that you can connect by default. It will just use this settings back to this workspace. If you have another one that you can use, you can switch that to be the default. So it just means that you can connect without having to name the workspace. So once you've configured that, and this is the place as well, if you have multiple workspaces, you can add a new workspace and the details there. You can copy from the Azure Sentinel UI, type it in. We don't really want to keep, we don't really have another workspace to work with, but you can do that. And once you've finished this particular set, update and then save settings. It will be saved inside the MSTICPy config YAML. We want to add a couple of more interesting things. So we want to add at least one threat intelligence provider and a GeoIP provider. And at this point, I'm going to demonstrate a bug that's recently appeared in the rendering of Azure Sentinel notebooks. So this UI that I just showed you up there, I pre-executed this because it was taking between 10 and 20 seconds to appear. I don't know quite why that is, but something we're investigating with the Azure ML team. But it seems like complex widgets like this seem to take a long time to display. So to add a VirusTotal key, you'll first need to go to the VirusTotal site, getting started page, sign up for an account. As part of that, you would get an API key, which is this long thing here. I don't think all of that is quite shown. This is a free key, by the way, so don't run off with this and try using it. I mean, it'll just get me into trouble with VirusTotal. I think, fortunately, not all of it's shown on there, but so you're not getting any value really by any more value than you would have by signing up if you steal my key. Same thing. Add the key, save the settings. Every time you save, you'll get a backup of the previous MSTICPy config YAML. And finally, for GeoIP, we're going to set up a MaxMind thing. And the instructions are here of like where to go to on the MaxMind site to get your API key and have it set up. So now assuming we've got it all set up, this is an important step because although we save the stuff to MSTICPy config YAML, MSTICPy itself doesn't know about that we've got new settings in there. So run refresh config to reload them. So now we should be ready to see if we can query anything from Azure Sentinel. And this is a place where we're going to load a query provider. And this is a good place to talk about this error you might see coming up. You can kind of ignore this, but it's a bit ugly. At the end of this notebook, I've got a set of frequently asked questions that tells you how to get rid of this if you just don't like seeing it. It's nothing to do with either MSTICPy or even the KQL magic package that we set up. It's to do with the Microsoft Authentication library running on certain versions of Linux. It doesn't affect our functionality, but if you want to get rid of it, there's a frequently asked questions thing. It's just installing a couple of packages on the Linux compute. So loading our Azure Sentinel query provider. Should be done. Taking a little bit of time. Then you need to authenticate back to Azure Sentinel. So you'll see in the next step, there'll be a workflow that when you try to connect. So we've loaded the query provider, but we haven't connected to anything yet. We haven't authenticated. So
yeah, this is a good thing to note, because I had a customer the other day asking if I would grant permissions to the workspace and to the compute ML, I'm giving away the secrets, the keys to my kingdom, to the workspace. So are you saying I still need to authenticate here with credentials to access my Azure Sentinel environment?
Yes. So you go through a standard Azure login. It uses a randomly generated device ID, so that it's plus all of the normal Azure two-factor authentication. So the authentication is kind of tied to this notebook. Now there's a way of, so at the moment, like by default, you will have to authenticate for every instance of a notebook. But there's another frequently asked question answer, which shows you how to use Azure CLI to authenticate once, and then for the whole session, it will reuse that session. You just run AZ login essentially from the compute, and then it will cache your credentials for 12 hours. So any notebook you use will, you won't have to follow this process. So the process is you get a prompt, you get a code, it's the randomly generated device ID, enter the code, enter your username. If you successfully authenticate, you've signed into the Kusto client. And you should get something that looks like this at the end of it, like a pop-up schema, and we can try that now.
So I still would be facing Azure RBAC and Azure Sentinel RBAC and roles, right? It's not that I'm getting specific access to my Azure Sentinel environment.
We don't store any keys or anything like that in the notebook, so you're not getting like backdoor access macros. Or...
Right. So it would be similar, me navigating to the Azure Sentinel portal, that would give me the same kind of access.
Yeah, and if you can see the thing I'm doing now, it's now prompting me on the phone to approve the logon.
Yeah, this is MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication.
Yep.
Right.
So we've now signed in. Go back to our notebook. You should, from the right notebook, eventually get confirmation that we've, did I close it? Well, let's see if we did actually authenticate successfully. So we've got a list of our schema, our tables. So it looks like now our notebook knows which tables are in Azure Sentinel. So it looks like that worked okay. We can use list queries from the command line. This thing we have a whole bunch of built-in queries that help you just kind of. So if you want all the logons on a host, you don't have to remember what that query looks like. And if you're a bit more UI inclined, there's a query browser that lets you look at all the individual queries. And again, this is suffering from the same bug as I talked about earlier, this like slow viewing of API, but for each of these, you'll see help associated with each query, which parameters are required, what the query text is itself, so you know exactly what you're getting. And you invoke each of these queries just by using the query provider we saw earlier. You invoke it as a function. And the parameters of the function are the query times and any other parameters like the host name that it requires. So there's a built-in time range control for the query provider. And this controls the default time range for all of the queries. You can override it per query, but if you don't supply any time ranges, this is kind of what will be used, but a little bit similar to the Azure Sentinel UI. And this is an example of running a query. So we're just getting a query that will use these time defaults. but it doesn't require any other parameters like a host name or IP address to run. The results are stored in signings df, and this is shown as the first 5 of these results. So this thing here is what's known as a pandas data frame, and it's a little bit like a programmatic version of Excel pandas. So you can see like rows and columns, very recognizable kind of way. And we do have in the tour of Cyber Notebook features, we have a brief introduction to pandas if you're not kind of familiar with it. Each query you can customize, so you can have it has this special query injection parameter called add query items, that you can add any kind of legal KQL query sort of statement to. So this could be something quite complex. So if you have a basic query that more or less does what you want, but you want to do, in this case, we're just getting a list of alerts, but we're adding, well, I want them summarized by alert name. And you can also do entirely custom queries. So here we just got query stored as a string. We can just execute that directly. So it looks like our queries are working, our authentication worked, configuration worked okay. We haven't yet tested the threat intelligence lookup. So we did configure a VirusTotal thing, which is already executing. We want to test that, can we connect to VirusTotal? Do we get meaningful results back? We've just looked up threat intelligence, like an IP address, VirusTotal, and it's given us details of response, which looks like quite bad, so don't go to this IP address. And we can do the same with configured our MaxMind API key as well, so we should be able to do Geolocation Lookup. And we seem to have found somebody in Germany there, for IP address. So to conclude this part of the notebook, and I'm kind of like way behind time here. I spent a long time talking about the Azure Sentinel UI more than I thought about. So this is like a basic getting things configured, getting things started. I want to, if I can, maybe 5 minutes, I can rush through a couple of kind of features of a couple of other features of MSTICPy. I did mention this frequently asked questions. You can use Git to clone all of the notebooks from our GitHub into your Azure ML workspace, rather than have to do the one by one thing I showed you before. This, like, get them one by one, because there are more notebooks in the GitHub. So you can clone all of those to your, will just appear as a folder here. You can, as you create a compute, you can also supply a script. You can do custom configuration, and then a few other things. So this, I mentioned this runtime dependency of PyG object missing, and how to cache your credentials using Azure CLI. I want to flip to this other notebook just to show you something a little bit more interesting. We should have authenticated here already. Let's see. Take the ones. So some of the visualization capabilities of notebooks and some of the base packages are also MSTICPy. I'm hoping that should have executed by now. Let's see. So we had our logons data frame. You can just use plot. So for any data frame, you can say plot, and it will plot a line graph. In this case, we wanted a bar graph. It just shows you the number of, just plotting number of connections by IP address. As plot pi, this just uses the Python matplotlib, which is like the default visualization for pandas data frames. We built a few visualizations of our own that are a bit more kind of something that are more like a SOC would want to use. So one of them is timeline control. And this is usually the same data, but it's showing what looks like a bar here. If you zoom in, you'll see these are actually individual events. So it's a different way of like visualizing chronological events, each of which has their own set of you can see the details of the individual events as you hover over it. You can kind of zoom around and pan. You can also make things a little bit more interesting by grouping. So here we've grouped by success. These are all the successful logons, but you may be more interested in the failed logons. There's another style of grouping. This time we want to group by application display name. And this breaks down, again, it's the same data set, but we're now looking at logons for different kind of target applications. And this might be, you can see here, this is like what looks like a very uninteresting kind of thing, but one or two of these things are relatively rare logon events. So that's kind of a nice visualization that supplements some of the underlying kind of Python things. If this works, this depends on a version we only just published. So, yeah, this is just an alternative version with IP address. Yeah, they're grouped by IP address. So we are running like close to the end of the session. So this tour of Cyber Notebook features, this is a relatively easy journey through some of the MSTICPy functions, and it's much better if you kind of get through this and learn it, look at it on your own. This notebook also comes with packaged data, so you don't even have to have an Azure Sentinel instance in order for this to work. It will download sample data from the GitHub, from our GitHub repo, and you can run the whole thing, look at the visualizations, the data enrichment. You will need things like the VirusTotal free API key and stuff like that to do threat intel, and maybe a max-mind lookup, but you don't necessarily need any connection to data. And it's also useful as well if you happen to have data that isn't very interesting, or maybe not much data yet in Azure Sentinel Workspace. You can use this and kind of play around and look at the help and mess with it. And I think I'm going to kind of leave it there. Pivot functions is something I think you should look at, because I've shown you some bits of functionality that are a little bit like some things come from this part of MSTICPy, some things come from that part of MSTICPy, but pivot functions centralize a lot of this functionality. So what do I mean by that? I mean, all of the functions we have that are related to IP addresses. So these could be queries, it could be geolocation lookup, it could be threat intel lookup. They're available as like sub-functions of the IP address entity. Similarly with DNS, we have, I think this will probably break because I've been skipping through this notebook, and that's one thing. I put warnings at the beginnings of both notebooks, go through the cells sequentially, otherwise it will break. Possibly will. So each of these things returns a data frame with first case it's resolved the DNS name to IP address, got the components, so you get the idea. And as I promised, in here we also have a basic introduction to pandas, which at least gets you going, being able to filter data, group it, pick out individual rows, and so forth. So that's worth having a look at as well. So I think I'm going to end it there because we have like only a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, that was great, Ian. I wanted to ask, so if I am totally new to notebooks. I've never played with one or used one. Would you recommend me to get a Python course, or just look at the getting started guide? Can I run that? What would you recommend for me to start?
I think so. Running this notebook, we have at the end of a notebook, as well as the frequently asked questions, we have a lot of resources in here. So basic introductions to notebooks,
Great.
documentation, and as you move through this notebook, you'll see in each section there are little like expandable things. So some that are more informative than that, but might have links here to find out more. I didn't learn more sections.
So I don't need immediate Python knowledge, right? I can just go through the notebook, learn from it, look at the examples, and I even don't have to have Sentinel data, because you just showed us that there is sample data I can use, which I can download if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. So that's what I did. I didn't show you that happening in this notebook, but like right at the beginning.
Oh, here it is.
I did like a bunch of, and this is data taken from Azure Sentinel from a demo instance that do different kinds of things. So it allows you to play around with stuff without having to.
Yeah, I can run a bunch of simulations, or actually against the sample data, and I can still explore this notebook.
Yep. And the way the data is loaded, it will. It looks as if it's coming from Azure Sentinel. The data queries work in the same way. You can at least use it to visualizations, and I said query the stuff from other sources like VirusTotal and Alien Vault and things like that.
Great. One last question, and we need to wrap up. Is how would you recommend if I use KQL queries, right? Is there a smart way to prevent making mistakes in a cell?
So I would say if you're developing a KQL query, you probably want to do that. You have a bit more help doing that in the Azure Sentinel portal.
Yeah, put it in search first, make sure it works, and then copy it over to notebooks.
Yeah. So there is some help in the notebook stuff, but the help is a bit terser.
Okay.
That's kind of what I do if I'm trying to develop a complex query. Build it there, make sure it's working, and then bring it back, and I may substitute parameters for more generic parameters. I don't want like hard dates and names. Okay,
great. We're on the top of the hour, so back to you, Hellen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This was a great information, and also thank you to the rest of the team. Thank you, Chief, for helping with answering the questions. As I'm wrapping up here, if you don't mind just advancing to the last slide, just so we're complying with the marketing. And all of the questions, thank you so much. All of the questions were answered, with the exception there will couple or maybe few related to the next week webinar regarding the automation. So we kept on mentioning Pete's webinar next week. We're meeting again next week with Tiander as well as Pete, and we'll be talking about streamlining your SOC workflow with automated notebooks. So stay tuned for that. And at the same time, I would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements, or just simply to engage with us, please visit us at aka.ms/security-community. And while you're there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and their communities. So thank you so much. And just in case we missed to answer your question, or if you have any additional questions, you can visit us on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. Thank you so much, and thank you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.